Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into, well, probably the most intense geopolitical flashpoint on Earth right now, the Taiwan Strait.
Mhm.
This isn't just a place where military tensions simmer. It's really the nexus where the risk of conflict meets the absolute highest stakes for the global economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So our mission today is to try and cut through some of the noise, analyze Beijing's strategic calculus. We want to look past maybe the fantasy of a massive full-scale invasion
Right.
to the potentially far more effective threat of a prolonged blockade. We're leveraging strategic wargame results and synthesizing expert insights here.
And this deep dive is, I think, crucial for you, the listener, because the focus isn't just on tanks and ships.
Yeah.
You know, it's a detailed look, as much as we can get, into the decision-making chambers of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP.
Right.
We're sifting through high-level military reports, complex war game summaries. You mentioned the think tanks, like Syracuse and CSIS, and detailed analyses of these big geopolitical shifts. We really need to understand the costs and benefits of pretty much every move Beijing might be considering.
And at the absolute core of all this, the kind of silent weapon in this entire equation is Taiwan's overwhelming dominance in the advanced semiconductor industry.
That's the linchpin.
Right. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, it's not just an important company, it is the strategic heart of the modern global tech supply chain. Its continued function is fundamentally tied to the health of the entire world economy. But this unique position means its status is both Taiwan's greatest asset, a guarantee that the world cares about its fate, and potentially its greatest liability in this escalating tension.
A double-edged sword, definitely.
Yeah.
So to start our analysis, I think we really need to acknowledge a significant pivot, an important one, in Taipei's strategic posture. Taiwan isn't just, let's say, a passive recipient of U.S. security guarantees anymore, relying only on military defense. It has visibly started learning to wield its market dominance specifically over those advanced logic chips proactively. It's a deliberate shift toward what experts are calling economic statecraft.
So this isn't just about accumulating wealth. It's about actually turning that production capacity into diplomatic muscle.
Precisely. And the shift in posture, it's been clearly documented in major strategic publications.
Right.
We have a really compelling argument outlining this new approach in the Diplomat magazine. There's a report, I think it was titled Taiwan's Weaponization of Semiconductor Exports by Pei Yu Wei. It came out October 7, 2025.
Okay, yeah.
And it argued that this shift represents a really profound new phase in Taiwan's economic statecraft. Basically, Taipei is formally recognizing that its control over components necessary for everything, AI, advanced military systems, you name it, is in fact a powerful diplomatic tool and a deterrent tool.
Okay, so what's the most specific, maybe recent illustration of this shift? I seem to remember the article highlighted a very particular unilateral action that kind of signaled this new intent.
It did, yeah. The key illustration cited in that report was Taiwan's unilateral decision to restrict semiconductor exports to South Africa.
Ah, right. South Africa.
Yeah, this was a very clear demonstration of capability, a willingness to use economic restrictions to pursue diplomatic aims that actually extend far beyond the immediate Taiwan Strait context.
And the importance of that action is that it set a precedent, right? It
Yeah.
showed Taipei was willing to take steps, maybe painful ones, globally disruptive ones, on its own terms.
Exactly. That specific move restricting access to crucial high-end components sent a clear, nonverbal message. To international powers, sure, but maybe more importantly to Beijing.
Yeah.
Economic leverage is now fully integrated into Taiwan's national resilience strategy. That's a policy championed by its current leadership, including President Lai Ching-te. By asserting this power to disrupt global technology flows if they're provoked, well, Taiwan turns its economic position into an active form of deterrence.
So they're basically saying we can inflict global economic pain potentially before any shots are even fired.
That's the idea. It's a classic asymmetric advantage. If Taiwan falls, maybe the world stops. If Taiwan simply restricts chips, the world slows down significantly.
Okay, so if Taiwan has this new, let's call it an economic weapon, how is Beijing planning to counter it? Does this economic coercion maybe push them toward a different kind of military action?
Oh, that economic weapon absolutely feeds into Beijing's planning, which is exactly why we need to focus on the operational choices they face. And to really understand the likelihood of, say, a massive invasion versus more limited coercion, we need to try and look through the eyes of the adversary.
Right.
Which is what international experts did in that Syracuse University war game back in August 2025.
Yeah, I find these war games fascinating because they often expose the assumptions built into our own military planning, right? What was the sort of profound insight that emerged when these experts, who are often focused on U.S. defense, actually took on the role of Chinese planners?
Well, the conclusion was pretty sharp.
Yeah.
The invasion scenarios that usually dominate U.S. military thinking,
Yeah.
the massive D-Day-style amphibious assaults, coupled with immediate preemptive strikes on American bases in Japan or Guam, they might fundamentally misread Beijing's likely strategy.
Okay.
When forced to think like the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, the planners revealed, well, a deep preference for political calculation and, frankly, minimal risk over just raw military force.
So the traditional view that China must immediately cripple U.S. assets to have any chance of victory is perhaps too aggressive for Beijing's actual risk profile.
That's the core finding, yeah. The wargamers debated three primary alternative scenarios that seem to reflect different risk tolerances for the CCP leadership.
Okay, what were they?
The first, and the lowest risk scenario, was a limited missile barrage, maybe targeting key government infrastructure, communication nodes, that kind of thing, followed almost immediately by a harsh diplomatic ultimatum.
Pure coercion.
Pure coercion, designed to shock Taipei into negotiation without risking the operational nightmare of a really messy invasion.
That seems like a really high-stakes bluff, though. If Taiwan just refuses the ultimatum, they're immediately back to square one, but now global attention is fully activated, right?
It is a gamble, which leads to the second path they considered.
Okay.
The second scenario was a graduated escalation. This would involve, increasing the severity of military action, maybe limited maritime seizures, cyber attacks, perhaps more widespread missile strikes, all designed to inflict increasing political and economic pain on Taiwan.
But the key difference is...
Critically, this scenario stops short of attacking U.S. forces in the region. The goal here is to force Taiwan's surrender through maybe domestic political collapse, exacerbated by military pressure, while carefully avoiding that catastrophic threshold of direct war with the United States.
And the third scenario, that must be the traditional full-spectrum assault we often see talked about.
That's right. The third was the traditional high-risk assault, an operation designed to immediately cripple U.S. forces right at the outset, to isolate Taiwan completely. It's the highest military risk, definitely, but if it's successful, it achieves the quickest military result.
Okay, here is where this restraint factor you mentioned becomes so interesting. Why would a massive military like the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, choose a graduated escalation or just a limited barrage over guaranteeing air superiority and isolating the battlefield by taking out U.S. forces immediately? Doesn't the PLA risk, catastrophic U.S. intervention if they wait?
That is the crucial political calculation. When they adopted Beijing's perspective, the participants recognized there is a natural, almost existential hesitancy to initiate a war with the United States if it can possibly be avoided.
Right. The goal isn't global war.
Exactly. The CCP's goal is political reunification, not World War III. If China refrains from attacking American, Japanese, or other allied forces in those opening rounds, there's no automatic guarantee of U.S. military involvement.
So they're essentially exploiting the inherent political difficulties, the hurdles an American administration faces in starting a massive overseas war of choice, especially if U.S. forces aren't hit first.
Precisely. If U.S. bases and personnel are untouched, the decision to commit American blood and treasure becomes politically fraught. It requires congressional buy-in, public support for casualties, which is never guaranteed, and a rapid abandonment of decades of strategic ambiguity. Chinese planners understand this very well. They would likely use this internal political difficulty in Washington to Beijing's advantage, making the U.S. the potential escalatory actor if it chooses to, say, run a blockade or interfere with limited military actions.
Yeah. It suggests that if Beijing has even, say, moderate confidence that they can achieve political reunification through limited force and maybe favorable terms like a coerced negotiation, they will probably choose that path, rather than risking a devastating global conflict right from day one.
They're looking for the minimum force required to achieve the maximum political result. That seems to be the underlying logic.
Okay, so this deep dive into calculated restraint makes the naval blockade, or this idea of a quarantine, seem like a tremendously appealing strategy for the CCP.
It does. It maximizes the potential for political victory, by economically suffocating Taiwan, while minimizing the immediate operational complexity of trying to land forces on contested beaches.
And it's also the maneuver that offers Beijing the best political cover internationally, right? What kind of legal language would they likely use to try and mask it?
Oh, they would frame the action very carefully to avoid triggering formal acts of war, which could immediately mobilize international military coalitions against them.
Yep.
So instead of calling it a blockade, which legally is an act of war, they would likely call it a quarantine. They'd reference the Cuban Missile Crisis playbook. Or maybe even frame it as a law enforcement action to patrol smuggling, or maybe, ironically, a health action.
That semantic distinction is absolutely vital, isn't it? It shifts the burden of escalation.
Completely.
If Washington or Taipei attempts to run a law enforcement quarantine, they risk being portrayed globally as the side that initiated the military confrontation. That gives Beijing huge propaganda leverage and could potentially create diplomatic splits among allies.
That's the coercion that flies just under the threshold of declared war.
Yeah.
And as wargame experts have repeatedly noted, this strategy could still bring Taiwan to its knees politically, because the island's economy is extraordinarily vulnerable to maritime disruption, specifically concerning energy.
Let's detail that vulnerability. The CSIS wargame findings painted a pretty devastating picture of Taiwan's energy security, as I recall.
They did. Taiwan imports a staggering 97% of its total energy requirements by sea. 97%.
Wow.
This reliance makes the island uniquely susceptible to any kind of blockade. And the most vulnerable fuel source isn't coal or oil, it's liquefied natural gas, LNG.
Which generates almost half their electricity, right?
Nearly half, yeah. And why is LNG the critical point of failure? It's because it's not stored in massive quantities like coal or crude oil can be.
Right, it needs those special cryogenic facilities.
Exactly. Those facilities are immensely expensive, difficult to build quickly. So Taiwan has minimal strategic reserves for LNG. The analysis showed that if shipments were completely cut off, Taiwan's existing LNG inventory would be entirely depleted in under 2 weeks.
Under 2 weeks, that's incredibly fast.
Less than 14 days. That time frame is the operational timeline the CCP would likely be targeting. It's not a prolonged conflict requiring years of reserves. It's potentially an instantaneous collapse of essential infrastructure.
And even the island's relatively more robust coal supply, which you said could last about 7 weeks, that wouldn't save them from immediate widespread power rationing, would it?
No. The political cost of that rationing would be immediate and severe for Taiwan's leaders. Power outages would ripple instantly through Taiwan's massive manufacturing sector, including, critically, those TSMC semiconductor fabs.
Ah, right. The fabs need absolutely stable power.
And a steady flow of necessary chemicals, also imported. Disrupting either shuts them down, which causes a global economic shock that could potentially force political capitulation far faster than an invasion ever could.
So even if Taiwan could technically feed its population, I think the estimate was 9 months on basic domestic agriculture.
Roughly, yes, on a basic diet.
But industrial output would just plummet almost immediately because of the lack of imported raw materials, components, and crucially, power.
Correct. The modern economy grinds to a halt very quickly.
And we've seen visible logistical preparations in China that seem to underscore their dual focus on both blockade and invasion readiness. They've massively expanded the plan, the People's Liberation Army Navy. It's now the world's largest navy by hull count. And they're developing highly specialized vessels specifically for this kind of purpose.
That dual-use capacity is absolutely key. We've seen satellite imagery confirming the readiness of large amphibious vessels. This includes the massive Type 071 landing platform docks, or LPDs,
Right.
and notably the Type 076 Yulon-class assault ship, sometimes referred to as the CNS Sichuan. This isn't just a bigger troop transport. The Type 076 is an aviation-capable amphibious assault ship. It signifies a major shift from just moving men to rapidly deploying a massive amount of heavy equipment, vehicles, helicopters, maybe even drones, across the strait.
And beyond just the sheer naval might, they seem focused on solving the immediate logistical problem of actually getting forces onto Taiwan's highly developed and likely defended coastlines.
They are. The Chinese planners recognize Taiwan's geography as probably its greatest defense. So to overcome the lack of suitable, wide-open landing beaches, they're building new specialized vessels. They're called the Shubikao amphibious transport barges.
Shubikao water bridge.
Literally water bridge, yeah. These are shallow draft barges designed specifically to deposit tanks, armored personnel carriers, other heavy vehicles directly onto coastal roads, or maybe shallow landing areas, effectively bypassing the constraints of Taiwan's rugged terrain and its few, very heavily fortified conventional landing zones.
So these preparations serve the coercive power of the blockade by making the invasion threat look more credible, while also actually paving the way for that nightmare scenario if coercion fails.
It's preparing for both contingencies simultaneously. But despite that rapid buildup of the plan, the military consensus, broadly speaking, remains that a full-scale amphibious invasion is still an operational nightmare. It's an undertaking of complexity that arguably dwarfs almost any military operation since World War II.
And largely because Taiwan's unique geography is just intrinsically hostile to invasion.
Absolutely. Let's visualize this again. You've got an 80-mile crossing of the straight, rough, open ocean, easily monitored. Then, the landing has to occur against a shoreline where over 60% of the island is dominated by serious mountains. We're talking peaks soaring well over 9,800 feet.
And crucially, the flat coastal land isn't convenient open beach or countryside, right?
It's dense urban development. The transition is instantaneous. From the sea, you basically hit dense cities and industrial zones. Taipei City, for example, has a population density comparable to New York City.
Wow.
Imagine fighting street by street, clearing high-rise apartment blocks, dense industrial areas, all while trying to maintain logistics across that 80-mile hostile strait. And the flat land that is available for maneuver, it transitions abruptly from dense urban sprawl to fortified agricultural areas like rice paddies. There's almost no open ground for heavy armor to consolidate forces easily.
History provides a pretty sobering parallel to this challenge. Even during World War II, U.S. planners, who obviously successfully executed massive amphibious assaults across the Pacific, they ultimately balked at the idea of seizing Taiwan, which was then called Formosa.
That's the key historical warning sign, I think.
Huh.
Operation Causeway, the Allied plan to invade Formosa, was ultimately recommended against by the highly experienced U.S. command structure.
Why specifically?
They calculated that seizing the island would require an immense effort, really rivaling the scale of the Normandy landings.
Yeah.
We're talking over 4,000 ships, something like 425,000 personnel. The sheer scale of the commitment and the projected casualties were just deemed too high. It forced them to pivot to Iwo Jima and Okinawa instead, which were themselves incredibly bloody.
And we also need to remember the PLA's own track record in contested amphibious landings, which is not exactly stellar. It's a historical point of failure for the communist forces.
Oh, that trauma definitely still lingers in the PLA's institutional memory. Their attempt to capture the Kinmen Islands, just off the coast, back in 1949. It was a complete logistical and operational disaster, made worse by bad weather, poor communication.
What happened?
The entire invasion force of over 9,000 soldiers was either killed or captured. That catastrophic failure serves as a perpetual, stark warning right there in Beijing about the sheer difficulty of a contested amphibious landing against a motivated, prepared adversary.
Okay, but let's say, hypothetically, the PLA somehow overcame that immense operational hurdle. The political risk of a full-scale invasion back home in China would still be immense, wouldn't it? Thanks to the lasting consequences of the one-child policy.
The demographic risk just cannot be overstated. Casualties incurred in a destructive invasion would be politically explosive for the CCP leadership. Because of the one-child policy, which lasted for decades? Well, every PLA soldier today often represents not just one family's tragedy, but potentially the end of up to 6 Chinese bloodlines. The soldier themselves, their 2 parents, and then 2 sets of grandparents, all potentially relying on or emotionally invested in that single child. The potential for mass casualties carries profound political and emotional consequences domestically, far exceeding just the military loss itself. It could threaten the CCP's very mandate of heaven, so to speak.
And what would they even be fighting for if the battle itself destroys the prize? This damaged prize problem seems like a huge factor.
Absolutely. A highly destructive invasion, characterized by street fighting, heavy bombardment. It would leave Beijing governing, or trying to govern, 24 million economically depressed and fiercely embittered citizens. That outcome severely undermines the core unification slogan, Chinese don't fight Chinese. Inheriting a broken, hostile territory makes political control nearly impossible. It would require a massive, long-term garrison force drawing on resources needed elsewhere. It's not an attractive outcome.
Which brings us back to the credibility problem. After the crackdown we saw in Hong Kong, how can Beijing possibly offer credible surrender terms that Taipei might actually accept, thereby avoiding all that destruction?
This was a major point of contention in the war games, reportedly. The swift and frankly brutal suppression of pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong demonstrated that Beijing was willing to completely abandon its one country, two systems framework. They substituted local leadership with appointed loyalists.
Right.
That precedent of suppression and replacement means Beijing's previous assurances of autonomy just ring hollow now. Wargamers apparently struggle immensely to craft surrender terms that would be genuinely enticing to Taipei, short of ironclad guarantees of maintaining the status quo, which the CCP is ideologically bound to reject.
So the lack of political trust forces Taiwan towards resistance,
Which in turn drives Beijing towards needing more destructive force.
making the prize potentially worthless. It's a vicious cycle. Okay, let's return to the strategic heart of this dilemma, the semiconductor prize. This industry just complicates Beijing's calculus even further. We have to ask, is controlling the chip industry the primary motivation for unification? Or is it merely a strategic obstacle they have to navigate?
Yeah, there are really two competing arguments dominating the analysis right now. One side argues that unification is purely a political and ideological imperative. It's tied to the CCP's core narrative of great rejuvenation, breaking U.S. containment in the region, national destiny, all that.
And in that view,
securing the chip fabs is secondary to achieving the political goal. If the fabs have to be destroyed to achieve unification, well, so be it. The political imperative trumps the economic one.
okay. And the other side focuses much more on the economic and geopolitical leverage.
Yes. The counter-argument maintains that control of the world's most advanced chip manufacturing, specifically, that 90% figure of the world's most advanced logic chips, is a fundamental strategic goal in itself. Because inheriting that capacity would offer Beijing unparalleled economic dominance and technological leverage over every major global economy. It provides a stranglehold that is immensely valuable, which makes the potential for inheriting a destroyed industry completely unacceptable.
This is where Taiwan plays its ace, isn't it? Taiwan has, over the last few years, seemingly armed itself with what might be the most powerful counter-deterrent of all. This credible threat of annihilation, often called the scorched earth deterrent.
That threat is what fundamentally changes the economic calculus of a destructive invasion. Taiwanese sources have credibly indicated they possess the capacity and, crucially, the political will to annihilate the chip fabrication facilities, the fabs, upon invasion. This is the ultimate poison pill.
How does that destruction work in practice, though? It's not simply a matter of rigging the facilities with conventional explosives, is it? I mean, that seems difficult to guarantee.
It's actually far more insidious and potentially more effective than conventional bombing. Modern chip fabrication, particularly using that extreme ultraviolet EUV lithography for the most advanced nodes, it relies on an impossibly delicate, ultra-clean environment.
Okay.
So destroying a fab doesn't necessarily require blowing it up. It just requires disrupting that pristine environment. Simply introducing common dust, contaminants, even, theoretically, fingerprints into the clean rooms would be sufficient.
Because even microscopic disruption can ruin these billion-dollar machines.
Absolutely. The specialized equipment, the lithography machines, the vacuum chambers, the chemical baths, they require years of precision calibration and operate at nanoscale tolerances. Introducing contaminants, disrupting the very precise climate control, temperature, humidity, or allowing minute particles of debris to settle would effectively halt production almost instantly.
And getting them back online.
The cleanup process is measured in years, if it's possible at all. And replacing the equipment is virtually impossible. Some of it is custom-made, highly restricted by international export controls, like the EUV machines from ASML in the Netherlands. China simply couldn't replicate it quickly, maybe ever. They would inherit buildings, but not a functioning industrial hub.
So this inherent fragility significantly reduces the economic incentive for a full-scale destructive invasion aimed at seizing the prize intact. Beijing risks achieving its political goal of unification only to inherit a basically technologically flattened rock, not a global industrial powerhouse.
And Taiwan seems to be strengthening its overall resilience with this reality in mind. They are conducting comprehensive whole-of-society civil defense drills. These are designed to prepare citizens for both natural disasters and unnatural disruptions caused by conflict. This effort aims to strengthen national resolve and the public's capacity to resist.
That public will is the other side of the coin, isn't it? I remember seeing a poll, maybe late 2024, indicating that a remarkable 2/3 of the Taiwanese population say they are willing to defend the island against a Chinese invasion.
That's a very high number.
That high level of civil resistance and national unity, it just compounds the psychological and military nightmare facing any invading force. It basically guarantees a prolonged and costly occupation, not a swift takeover, even if the initial landing succeeded.
Which brings us to the final and maybe the most decisive variable in Beijing's decision matrix, the uncertainty surrounding U.S. intervention. The entire foundation of this geopolitical standoff rests on the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act,
Right.
which commits the U.S. to providing arms for Taiwan's defense, but deliberately maintains strategic ambiguity regarding whether U.S. forces would actually directly intervene militarily.
That ambiguity is critical, and it's being, let's say, severely tested by recent political actions, particularly out of Washington. We've seen reports concerning President Trump, for instance, that have actively injected doubt into that deterrence model.
Yes, exactly. Reports that the previous administration paused, I think it was $400 million in weapons deliveries, and the decision to deny President Lai Ching-te a stopover while traveling. These actions fueled intense speculation globally.
About what, specifically?
About whether Taiwan could be perceived as a bargaining chip, potentially leveraged in future trade deals with Beijing. Injecting that kind of chaos, that uncertainty, into the deterrence model is incredibly dangerous because it raises fundamental doubts about whether the U.S. commitment is truly ideological or merely transactional.
But regardless of the strategic ambiguity or the current political maneuvering, the underlying geopolitical stakes remain immense, right? Even without a formal treaty-bound obligation like NATO, the U.S. would likely intervene for two overwhelming strategic reasons, wouldn't they?
Almost certainly. The first is maintaining credibility. If the U.S. allows a vital democratic partner, an economic powerhouse like Taiwan, to be forcibly absorbed, its credibility with key allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, would just evaporate overnight. The entire Pacific Alliance structure could become useless.
And the second is geographical. This centers on the concept of the first island chain. Beijing views breaking this chain as critical to its global expansion. Can you just quickly define what that chain is and why breaking it matters so much?
Sure. The first island chain is basically a series of archipelagos, stretching from the Kuril Islands in the north, south through the main Japanese islands, crucially including Taiwan, then the Philippines, and down towards Borneo.
Okay.
For decades, this chain has served as a kind of natural geographic barrier containing the PLA Navy, limiting its easy access to the open Pacific Ocean for global power projection. Preventing China from breaking this chain and achieving domination of the Western Pacific is a core tenet of U.S. grand strategy.
And if Taiwan falls?
If Taiwan falls, that chain is decisively broken. It allows the PLA Navy free access to the global maritime environment. It fundamentally shifts the balance of power in Asia and arguably the world.
So this uncertainty, whether the U.S. president would authorize force, whether Congress would back it, whether the American public would accept casualties, this shapes every single decision made by Chinese planners, whether they're considering a limited quarantine or a full invasion.
Absolutely. And this underscores why effective deterrence requires denying China easy political victories, not just focusing on military denial. We also have to acknowledge the highest level of risk. Any large-scale confrontation involving the U.S. or its major allies, even if it starts conventionally, carries the inherent terrifying risk of nuclear escalation. That hangs over the entire conflict, forcing a degree of restraint on both sides, hopefully.
Okay, finally, we compared Taiwan's energy vulnerability earlier. Let's conclude the strategic comparison by looking at China's own critical weakness, its vulnerability to a potential counter-blockade.
Right. China's economic miracle, its stability, relies heavily on global trade, particularly its massive imports of oil, natural gas, specialized components, raw materials. If China imposes a naval blockade on Taiwan, the U.S. and its allies possess the capacity to impose immediate crippling sanctions and, crucially, use their own naval power to disrupt China's own vital imports.
The ultimate global choke point for China being the Strait of Malacca, right, where most of its oil and resources have to pass.
That's the big one. Targeting that maritime choke point, perhaps using allied submarines or naval patrols, could effectively grind China's manufacturing and potentially its military machine to a halt within months, not years.
And the risk of that kind of economic collapse?
That's an outcome Beijing desperately wants to avoid. It threatens domestic stability, the CCP's legitimacy. It makes the trade-off of initiating a blockade strategy incredibly risky for their own internal future as well. #Cowtag outro. So to try and synthesize the core tensions revealed by this deep dive, a full-scale invasion of Taiwan looks like an operational nightmare. It's burdened by massive domestic political risk, largely due to the demographic consequences of casualties, and it carries a low probability, arguably, of securing the intended economic prize, those intact, functioning semiconductor fabs.
Right. Conversely, the blockade or quarantine strategy seems to offer Beijing a pathway to coercive political victory, potentially by rapidly collapsing Taiwan's energy and industrial base. However, that coercive approach carries its own higher risk immediate escalation into a direct confrontation with the U.S., or triggering immediate crippling counter-sanctions and a counter-blockade against China's own vital energy and resource imports.
So the decision calculus facing Beijing's leadership is just defined by immense risk on pretty much all fronts: military, economic, political. Every major option carries the potential for absolute disaster, forcing planners to weigh political necessity against economic survival, against international isolation. It's an incredibly difficult position.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this incredibly complex and frankly concerning global challenge.